Hey guys, tonight we slip into the velvet shadows of Topkapi Palace, the very heart of Ottoman power in the year 1574. The torches flicker across marble courtyards, their flames snapping in the cool Bosphorus breeze. You stand at the outer gate, hearing the low murmur of servants scurrying, the clatter of sandals on stone, and the faint strains of a knee flute drifting from some inner chamber. The air carries the mingled smell of roasting lamb, perfumed oils, and something sour, fear. Because within these high walls the Empire's secrets are not written in golden ink, but carved into the lives of those who can never leave. Tonight, you're not here as a guest, you're here as one of them. A boy, purchased or captured, led inside to become a concubine. The halls are heavy with silence, and if you survive this night, you may never truly belong to yourself again. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. Before we dive deep, don't forget, if this strange little window into Ottoman darkness grabs your curiosity, hit that subscribe button and let's unravel more unsettling corners of history together. And since we're peeking into the secret midnight of Istanbul's palaces, drop your location and your local time in the comments, because somewhere, right now, someone else is awake and listening in the shadows with you. Sweet dreams? Maybe not tonight. Alright, breathe in that tension because the gates are shutting behind you. You're in now. The Ottomans built their empire on conquest, discipline, and control. And nowhere was control more absolute than in the harem. Now, when most people hear harem, they picture jewelled cushions, female concubines, and silken veils. That's not wrong, but it's only half the story. Guards inspect your teeth, your skin, your hair. They don't ask you questions. Your voice doesn't matter. A hand pulls your chin up, another traces your shoulders. You're merchandise. If you're lucky, you'll be fed and taught to read. If unlucky, you'll be assigned to scrub latrines until the day someone decides you're replaceable. Already you feel the dread settle in. You don't belong to yourself anymore. You belong to the Sultan. The Ottomans didn't call them concubines openly when referring to boys. The preferred term was hizmetkala, servants. It was safer, less scandalous on paper. But everyone in the palace knew what it meant. Male concubines weren't only about labour, they were objects of intimacy and amusement. A sultan might favour one for companionship, another for his musical skills, another for his body. What outsiders never saw was the constant tension in these boys' lives. A favour could raise you to comfort. Falling out of favour could erase you overnight. And here's the creepy part. The Ottoman palace wasn't unique in this. From the Abbasid caliphs to Byzantine courts, rulers had a tradition of surrounding themselves with favourites. But the Ottomans perfected it into a chilling science. They kept registers. They monitored bloodlines. They enforced rules so strict that even a smile in the wrong direction could cost you everything. You, the concubine, learned fast to lower your eyes, to never speak first, and to erase the thought of escape from your mind. Life inside was a paradox. Luxury and terror intertwined. The cushions were embroidered with gold. The fountains trickled with rosewater, but your body was never truly your own. You were paraded at feasts made to dance or sing, sometimes dressed in fine silks that mocked the chains around your freedom. Imagine the laughter of courtiers echoing while your heart pounded in dread of making a single mistake. A clumsy move, a sour note, could brand you as useless. And useless things didn't last long here. The first days were always the hardest. You're locked in a dormitory with dozens of others, some whispering in languages you don't understand. The doors close at night with a thud like a coffin lid. The lamps flicker out. In the darkness you hear someone crying softly into his blanket. Another praying in a tongue you vaguely recognize from home. You try to keep still. The black eunuch who patrols the hall has ears sharper than a hunting dog. If he hears noise, the punishment comes swift. A whipping, a night of hunger, or worse. Punishment was a constant shadow. Ottoman records hint at methods that make your skin crawl. A boy caught stealing food might be made to stand for hours, hands tied above his head, while others filed past to mock him. A concubine suspected of disobedience could be beaten with rods, his screams muffled by pillows so the palace wouldn't hear. And the ultimate punishment, execution, was carried out with strangling cords, silk ropes pulled tight until silence returned. Silk was chosen not for softness, but for its irony. Beauty suffocating life. Yet not everything was brutality. Sometimes the creepiest thing was the kindness. Imagine being summoned by the Sultan. You're bathed, perfumed, dressed in clothes finer than any you've ever touched. He smiles at you. He offers sweet sherbet. He listens to your song. For a moment, you feel safe, even proud. But deep down, you know this kindness isn't yours. It's borrowed. Tomorrow, he may never look at you again. Or worse, he may give you away as a gift to some pasha, as if you were a fine horse. The kindness was a trap, binding you tighter than chains ever could. Some boys tried to resist, whispering about escape or rebellion, but the palace was a labyrinth, with walls thicker than hope. Outside, Istanbul itself was no refuge. You were foreign, enslaved, and hunted. A concubine who tried to flee rarely lasted more than a day before being dragged back. The punishment for such defiance was public enough to terrify the rest. They didn't need many examples. One broken body left in the courtyard could silence hundreds. And then there was the strangest rule. You could never grow into a rival. The moment you looked too confident, too clever, too ambitious, your days were numbered. Sultans feared competition even from their servants. So you learned to shrink yourself, to play the fool, to survive by invisibility. It was survival by erasure, becoming so forgettable you slipped past danger. But what does it do to a person, living like a shadow in silk? That's the haunting part. Now imagine the older concubines teaching you. They don't smile much. Their eyes are distant, hollowed out by years of obedience. One might whisper, "Never look him in the eyes." Another hisses, "Always laugh at his jokes." These aren't friendly tips. They're survival codes passed down like folklore. You cling to them, even though you know that one day your luck may run out anyway. The palace wasn't merely a home for pleasure. It was a machine for control, and male concubines were its cogs. They guarded secrets. They became spies. They learned the habits of the sultan, the moods of the valid sultan, the alliances of viziers. Information dripped from them like water, and one careless word could drown you. Even the walls seemed to listen. No wonder the concubines spoke little. Their voices worn down to whispers. And yes, there were whispers beyond the walls. European ambassadors occasionally wrote about the male favourites hidden in the Ottoman palace. They never used flattering terms. To them, the very existence of boys serving in such roles was scandalous, proof of Oriental decadence. But what the Europeans missed was the sheer scale of control behind it. This wasn't indulgence alone, it was domination, built into the bones of empire. As the night deepens in your imagination, you walk through the tiled halls, hearing echoes of laughter and cries that blend into one chilling chorus. You pass by rooms where musicians play to cover the sound of discipline. You glimpse shadows kneeling before thrones. You feel the weight of history pressing down, reminding you that thousands lived and died in these walls, their names erased, their bodies discarded, their stories whispered only in fragments. And maybe the creepiest thing of all, you realise that this system lasted for centuries. Generations of boys walked these halls, played their roles, suffered their fates. It wasn't a brief moment, it was tradition. Institutionalised, polished, passed down like a crown jewel. And every time the gates shut at night, another boy lay awake, wondering if he'd see the dawn. You're standing now deeper in the palace, past the courtyards and tiled arches, led into chambers where the power of the Ottoman dynasty breathes in silence. The air is cooler here, pressed down by thick stone walls and the weight of secrets. This is where the role of the eunuchs begins to reveal itself. These men, once boys like you, castrated and transformed, became the keepers of the palace, the wardens of the sultan's private world. Without them, the entire system of male concubinage could not have existed, and their presence is as unsettling as it is absolute. Eunuchs held a paradoxical power. On the one hand, they were mutilated, their masculinity taken away violently. On the other, they were elevated to positions of trust closer to the sultan than almost anyone else. The Ottomans leaned on this paradox deliberately. By cutting them off from wives, children, and legacies, the empire created servants who lived and died for the palace alone. No family loyalty, no outside heirs, just pure devotion to the system. Creepy efficiency if you think about it. The process was brutal. Most eunuchs came from outside the empire, boys captured in Africa, often Sudan or Ethiopia, marched across deserts or shipped across seas. Castration wasn't performed with care or anesthesia. Knives, heated irons, and a basin of water, that was it. Many didn't survive. Those who did were considered purified. their lives redirected into palace service. From that moment, they ceased being boys with villages, names, and futures. They were the Sultan's property, their identities erased and rewritten with Ottoman ink. Now imagine the first encounter you'd have as a concubine with these eunuchs. You'd expect sympathy. After all, they too had been victims. But no, their suffering turned into cruelty. They became enforcers, stern and unyielding. Their authority was absolute in the harem. They locked the gates, they controlled access, they silenced whispers. They weren't just guards. They were the eyes and ears of the Sultan himself. Think of the hierarchy. White eunuchs, usually Europeans castrated before entering, handled administrative duties in outer sections. Black eunuchs, recruited from Africa, became the true powers of the inner palace. They guarded both female and male concubines, ensuring that no secret contact, no rebellion, no forbidden desire took root. The chief black eunuch, the Kızlar Asa, was among the most powerful men in the empire, sometimes more influential than viziers or generals. His reach extended to every pillow and every whisper in the Sultan's household. The creepy brilliance of the system was how the Ottomans weaponized intimacy. Who else but a eunuch could be allowed into the private quarters of the Sultan's women and boys without suspicion? Who else could keep order in spaces the outside world could never see? By stripping away their reproductive power, the empire granted them political power. And so you, as a male concubine, quickly learned that your true master was not only the Sultan, but also these watchful eunuchs. Your daily life passed under their gaze. At dawn, the eunuchs rang gongs or clapped loudly to wake the dormitories. You rose from your hard mat, folded your blanket in silence, and stood in line. One by one they inspected you, eyes down, back straight, no hesitation. A cough, a bruise, a nervous twitch. They noted everything. You weren't simply living, you were catalogued. Then came the drills. Eunuchs trained concubines not just in service but in obedience. You were taught how to walk properly, how to kneel, how to bow so low your forehead touched the ground. You learned to serve food in a precise way, never letting your hands tremble as you held a silver tray. You practiced music until your fingers cramped, poetry until your tongue stumbled, calligraphy until your eyes blurred. The eunuchs weren't artists themselves, but they knew discipline, and discipline was the essence of your survival. What makes this especially chilling is how eunuchs used punishment to maintain control. A mistake might earn you a beating with rods. Defiance meant days without food. Some punishments were subtler. Isolation in a dark cell, the terror of being forgotten. The psychological weight was worse than the physical. You started to believe you weren't a person, but a vessel, an instrument waiting to be used. The eunuchs themselves, for all their authority, weren't free either. They too lived inside the palace, confined by the same walls, their existence defined by servitude. But unlike the concubines, they wielded the whip instead of receiving it. That imbalance bred a cold detachment. When they looked at you, they didn't see a fellow sufferer. They saw a tool, and in using you as a tool, they convinced themselves that their own mutilation had meaning. Creepy, right? Suffering weaponized into loyalty. There's a detail often overlooked. Eunuchs kept records. The Ottomans loved bureaucracy, and the harem was no exception. Lists of names, ages, training progress, punishments. Everything was written down. If you were a concubine, your life could be summarized in ink. Age 12, from Bosnia, skilled in singing, punished once for disobedience. That might be all that remained of you in the archives. Centuries later, a historian reads your existence in a single line, stripped of humanity. The paper outlives the person. But don't think eunuchs were only about order. They also served as intermediaries between the Sultan and his concubines. If the Sultan desired someone, a eunuch delivered the summons. If the Sultan dismissed someone, a eunuch carried out the removal, sometimes with a silk cord around the neck. You never knew if a eunuch approaching your dormitory door meant elevation or death. That uncertainty gnawed at you every night. And here's where the creep factor climbs. Eunuchs weren't entirely powerless in choosing who rose and who fell. A word in the Sultan's ear, a subtle suggestion, a delay in delivering a message. These could shift the fate of a concubine. Some eunuchs accepted bribes, favours, or even companionship in exchange for protection. Others relished playing judge, dangling hope before crushing it. Imagine lying awake, knowing that your survival might hinge on whether a eunuch liked the way you bowed this morning. Let's pause and look at the bigger picture. The Ottomans designed this system deliberately. They created a network where no one, neither concubines nor eunuchs, could escape their role. Everyone was compromised. Everyone was trapped. For the Sultan, this meant absolute control. No concubine could rebel because eunuchs watched them. No eunuch could rebel because they had no families to support them outside. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining machine of obedience. And you? You were the raw material fed into it. The strangeness goes further. Eunuchs sometimes rose to incredible power. The Qızlar Arsa controlled enormous wealth, donated to mosques, influenced foreign policy, and whispered in the Sultan's ear. Think about it. A man castrated as a boy in Sudan might, decades later, command armies and alter the empire's fate. And yet, at the same time, he supervised whether you, a trembling concubine, knelt properly before serving sherbet. The scale of power swung wildly, but always at your expense. If you were unlucky enough to be favoured by a cruel eunuch, your life could be twisted into torment. Some eunuchs used concubines as pawns, pushing them into dangerous roles to advance their own schemes. Others deliberately humiliated them, reminding them constantly of their worthlessness. One misstep, and you might find yourself ordered to dance in front of jeering courtiers, your dignity stripped as thoroughly as your freedom. What's eerie is how normalised all this became. The palace operated like clockwork, cruelty woven into daily routine. When new boys arrived, older concubines didn't whisper about escape or rebellion. They taught survival instead, how to anticipate the eunuch's moods, how to read the glint in their eyes, how to disappear when needed. Resistance wasn't just futile, it was unthinkable. The walls of the harem weren't just physical, they were psychological, built inside your mind until you could barely imagine life beyond them. Everywhere you turned, a eunuch's shadow fell across you. In the baths, in the training halls, in the dormitories, they were there. Even when you knelt to pray, their sandals scraped the stone behind you, a reminder that your devotion belonged first to the Sultan. Privacy didn't exist. You learned to breathe softly, to sleep lightly, to suppress your thoughts before they could surface. Living under constant surveillance wasn't just uncomfortable, it reshaped who you were. At night, lying on your thin mat, you sometimes heard the eunuch's own footsteps echoing through the halls, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. Each step was a reminder. You are owned, you are watched, you are replaceable. And the scariest realization of all, you began to believe it. That was the eunuch's true power. Not the whip, not the rod, not the strangling cord. Their power was convincing you that you had none. So here you are, a boy in silk and shadow, caught between two masters, the Sultan who may never know your name, and the eunuch who knows every breath you take. Neither offers escape. Both define you. And as you lie awake, staring into the dark rafters of the dormitory, you realize that survival here isn't about strength or courage. It's about submission so total that even your dreams bow their heads. The corridors of the palace echo differently now. You've grown used to the shuffle of eunuchs, the barked orders, the endless drills. But when you first entered, the way you got here was as much a nightmare as the life you're living now. Few came willingly. The majority of boys who became concubines were kidnapped, sold, or forced into service against their will. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear the faint cries of children pulled from villages across the empire, carried off toward Istanbul with no chance of return. The empire's appetite for bodies never ended. Boys were gathered from across conquered lands. Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Circassians, Persians, Albanians, even Italians caught in raids on coastal towns. Sometimes they were taken during war, rounded up in chains after villages were burned. Sometimes they were bought in bustling slave markets that smelled of sweat, fear and spices. A merchant's hand would grab your jaw, tilt your face toward the light, and announce your price. A coin exchanged, and your entire life shifted from free child to concubine in waiting. Imagine being 12 years old, playing in the dust of a village square, when horsemen ride in. Shouts, screams, the stamp of hooves. By nightfall, you and a handful of other boys are roped together, trudging down a road you've never seen. The smell of smoke still lingers from the homes left burning behind you. Some cry for their mothers, others stay silent, stunned into numbness. You walk because stopping means a whip across the back. Every step takes you farther from your family and closer to a palace you don't yet know exists. The journey itself was often deadlier than the palace. Marches lasted weeks, sometimes months. Boys were forced to walk barefoot over rocky terrain, through snow or across desert sands. Food was scarce, water scarcer. If one of you stumbled too many times, the slavers didn't waste energy on compassion. A knife, a shove into a ravine, and the caravan moved on. Better to lose one than slow the profit. You began to realize quickly that survival wasn't guaranteed. And worse, you were valuable only as long as you were alive enough to sell. Markets in places like Istanbul, Cairo, or Bursa thrived on this human trade. The air buzzed with haggling voices. Buyers strolled casually, inspecting boys as if they were livestock. They checked teeth, pinched arms to gauge muscle, even examined scars to see if you'd been hardened by work. You didn't speak their language, but you understood their meaning. You were a product. One man admired your hair, another scoffed that you looked weak. Eventually someone nodded, coins clinked, and your fate was sealed. From then on, you weren't even allowed to imagine going home. If you were unlucky, you went straight into hard labour, serving households or galleys. But if you were considered attractive, clever, or simply young enough, you might be purchased for the palace. That's when the second nightmare began, the slow stripping away of everything that connected you to your past. First, your name. A new Ottoman name was given, Ali, Mehmed, Hassan. Short, simple, easy to control. Then your clothes, replaced with palace uniforms. Even your language was beaten out of you. Lessons in Turkish began immediately, and if you slipped into your native tongue, punishment followed. Every part of you was reshaped to fit the empire's mould. And here's the chilling part. Sometimes parents gave up their sons willingly. Poverty crushed families, and the promise of palace life seemed like salvation. A boy might eat better, learn to read, maybe even rise to influence. So mothers handed children to recruiters, tears mixing with hope. They told themselves their sons were lucky. But those who ended up in the concubine system rarely sent letters home, rarely returned. The hope was an illusion. The palace swallowed them whole. Among the darkest routes into concubinage was the capture of children during raids across the Mediterranean. Ottoman corsairs, the feared pirates of the empire, swept coastal villages in Italy, Spain, and the Balkans. Ships returned laden with goods, and with boys destined for the Sultan's harem. Picture being dragged from a fishing boat, your cries drowned by waves, only to be chained below deck for weeks. The stench of vomit and salt filled your lungs until you staggered into Istanbul's slave markets, blinking at the sudden blaze of sunlight on domes and minarets. The city dazzled, but it wasn't welcoming. For those who survived capture and arrival, the indoctrination began immediately. Palace officials separated boys into categories: labourers, soldiers, servants, or concubines. Your height, beauty, and demeanour determined your placement. Some were marched into the barracks, trained for janissary service. Others, smaller or prettier, were led deeper into the palace. That's when you realised your fate wasn't just about survival. It was about submission. Inside the palace, kidnapping blurred into ownership. There were no documents to prove your past, no witnesses to claim you. You were cut off, deliberately. Concubines rarely knew if their families still lived, and even if they did, the palace had ways of ensuring you never saw them again. Isolation made you pliable. Without roots, you clung to the only authority you had left: the eunuchs, the sultan, the system. That's what made kidnapping so effective. It didn't just move bodies, it erased identities. The creepy irony: some of these boys grew to believe the palace had saved them. Compared to starving in a war-torn village, life in silk with regular meals and baths looked like luxury. They convinced themselves this was fortune, not theft. But deep down, they knew the freedom to leave was gone. Even gratitude became another layer of chains, binding you tighter because you began to accept the lie. Think about the psychological toll. You're 13, living in a dormitory with strangers, everyone speaking different dialects, all united by loss. You whisper stories about your homes at night, only to watch those memories fade with time. Eventually, you stop mentioning your mother's voice or your father's face because the images blur too much. Survival means letting go, and letting go means forgetting. By the time you're 16, your childhood feels like a story you once read, not something you lived. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. And yet, the machinery of abduction continued century after century. The empire needed concubines, and so it pulled from the endless reservoir of human misery beyond its borders. Each boy thought his suffering unique, but in truth he was one of thousands, part of a conveyor belt feeding the palace. That's what makes it so haunting. The sheer repetition. Lives swallowed, one after another, until the palace echoed with voices that no one outside ever heard. What about resistance? Rare. Entire villages sometimes tried to hide their boys, smearing them with dirt, disguising them as girls, even sending them into forests during collection raids. Some families fled altogether, abandoning homes to save their children. But the Ottoman machine was relentless. Soldiers came back again and again, sweeping wider, searching deeper. Fear spread so far that parents taught their children not to speak loudly in case recruiters overheard. Silence itself became a survival tactic. Even so, abductions were ritualized. Caravans entered Istanbul with drums beating, slaves paraded as spoils of conquest. The city celebrated, indifferent to the tears of chained boys, and when the palace gates opened to swallow them, the crowds dispersed, returning to markets and mosques as if nothing had happened. That public-private contrast was chilling. Abduction in daylight, silencing in shadow. Once inside, you never really escaped the memory of how you arrived. Even decades later, older concubines would recall flashes, the crack of whips, the smell of burning homes, the sound of mothers screaming names. Some buried those memories so deep they emerged only in nightmares. Others clung to them, whispering them as warnings to new arrivals. "Don't trust kindness," an older boy might mutter. "Remember how you got here." Those words lingered like ghosts, reminding you that your first step into the palace was already a stolen one. And here's a twist. The palace itself reinforced the trauma. Ceremonies reminded concubines that they were possessions, trophies of empire. At feasts, boys might be paraded before the Sultan and his viziers as living proof of Ottoman might. "See," the display implied, "even the children of our enemies serve us now." The humiliation was systemic, embedded in ritual, ensuring you never forgot your origin as plunder. The sheer scale of kidnapping is hard to grasp today. We tend to think of slavery in terms of ships crossing oceans, but the Ottoman system was vast, stretching from the Balkans to North Africa. Each year, countless boys disappeared into its folds. Some became soldiers, some became servants, some became concubines. All shared the same erasure, their lives stolen, rewritten in Ottoman ink. And when you lie awake in the dormitory, staring at the carved ceiling, you realise you're one of them now. You're part of the pattern, another ghost in silk. The creepiest detail? For most, there was no escape, not even in death. Those who died in the palace were buried in anonymous graves, their pasts unrecoverable. Families back home whispered legends about lost sons, never knowing their fates. The empire thrived on that silence, on the fact that nobody outside really knew what happened behind the gates. That ignorance was as effective as any wall. So, when you think of Ottoman concubinage, don't just picture the gilded halls and embroidered cushions. Picture the beginning, the snatch of a child, the chains, the markets, the renaming, the erasure. The palace was not built on marble alone. It was built on stolen lives, each one carried off in the night, each one reduced to service, each one swallowed whole by an empire that never stopped hungering. And you, sitting here centuries later, can almost feel that hunger echoing in the stone. The sound of boots echoing down the marble hallway snaps you back into the present. You've already learned that every corridor in the palace carries secrets, but one of the darkest channels of supply for male concubines came through the infamous devsham system. If kidnapping and slave markets fed the harem through raw violence and commerce, then devshami, the so-called blood tax, wrapped that violence in bureaucracy and ritual. It was one of the most efficient and chillingly organised ways the Ottoman state harvested boys for its own use, and among them, some were siphoned off into palace life as concubines. The word itself meant collection, and that's exactly what it was. A systematic gathering of Christian boys from conquered Balkan territories. Villages in modern-day Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Bosnia and Serbia lived in dread of the devshami officers arriving. At intervals, often every 3 to 5 years, Ottoman officials would descend, accompanied by soldiers and clerks, and summon the community. A list was drawn, boys lined up, and selections made. It was as if the empire were running a livestock fair, except the livestock were children with mothers weeping in the background. The official story was almost clinical. Boys between the ages of 8 and 18 were to be taken, with preference for those who were strong, healthy and intelligent. They were described as recruits, destined for service to the Sultan, and technically forbidden from being orphans or only sons, though in practice, rules bent easily when quotas needed to be filled. You can imagine the dread in a parent's chest. Each time the Ottoman riders appeared, there was a chance their child would be swallowed into the system forever. Now, the common narrative of Devshirme usually ends with janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire trained from childhood to serve as soldiers utterly loyal to the Sultan. But what slips quietly into the margins is the fact that not every boy went into the army. Some of the most attractive, docile, or talented were siphoned into the palace itself. They were trained not with swords, but with songs, etiquette, and silence. These were the ones most likely to become concubines, living ornaments for the Sultan's private world. Picture it. A boy from a mountain village in Bosnia, blonde hair catching the sunlight, is marked by the officials. His mother clutches his arm, begging. The officer shrugs her off, noting his features in a ledger. Later, when the caravan of selected boys reaches Istanbul, that blonde hair, those delicate features catch another official's eye. Not for the barracks, the decision comes, for the palace. And just like that, his path veers from soldier to concubine. The trauma began at the moment of collection. Imagine yourself in that line, dust swirling as neighbours sob, the sound of livestock lowing somewhere in the background. A clerk with an ink-stained hand points to you. Your family shouts. You're pulled away, pushed toward a group of strangers. Within hours, you're walking down the road, the village behind you fading into the horizon. You don't know it yet, but you'll never see it again. The Ottomans were efficient. The separation was permanent. The march to Istanbul was grueling. Boys travelled in groups, sometimes chained, always guarded. Food was rationed and discipline was harsh. Any sign of defiance could mean beatings or abandonment. Some boys tried to run. Few succeeded. The Ottoman state viewed them as investments, and investments were protected. By the time the group arrived in the capital, the boys were half-starved, bewildered, and ready to be reshaped. Once in Istanbul, the real sorting began. Examiners assessed posture, features, and demeanour. The strong and broad-shouldered were sent toward military training. The clever, the ones who picked up Turkish quickly, were marked for administrative service. And the beautiful, the graceful, the ones whose faces carried something striking, they were diverted into the palace. They became pages, attendants, favourites, or concubines. Their future was not the battlefield, but the Sultan's gilded cage. And here's where the creep factor deepens. The system cloaked itself in legitimacy. Parents were told this was an honour, that their sons were chosen to serve the greatest ruler of the age. Communities sometimes convinced themselves this was destiny. But to the boys themselves, the truth was starker. You were property. Your body, your voice, your very thoughts belonged to the empire. Inside the palace, the Devshirme boys underwent forced Islamization. Baptismal names were discarded, replaced with Muslim ones. Circumcision ceremonies were performed whether the boys consented or not. Daily prayers were drilled into them. Language lessons in Turkish and Arabic erased their native tongues. What looked like education from the outside was, in reality, erasure. A systematic stripping away of identity so complete that within a few years, many boys could barely remember the words of their mother's lullabies. For those sent into the concubine path, training diverged from that of janissaries. You were taught to move with elegance, to serve sherbet with steady hands, to play the oud, to recite poetry that pleased the Sultan. You learned to anticipate moods, to flatter without seeming obvious, to make yourself available yet invisible. It wasn't about fighting skills, it was about survival in intimacy. The harem demanded submission that was both physical and psychological. But here's the creepiest twist. Devshirme boys were technically slaves, yet some rose to enormous power. Janissaries became generals, administrators became viziers, and a select few concubines became trusted confidants of the Sultan himself. This possibility of elevation dangled like bait. You told yourself, if I obey, if I serve well, maybe I'll rise, maybe I'll escape the dormitories, maybe I'll survive. The promise of advancement kept you pliant, even as the walls closed in. Of course, not everyone thrived. Many concubines disappeared into anonymity, their names never recorded beyond a line in a register. Those who displeased a eunuch, annoyed a superior, or failed to meet expectations might be cast aside, reassigned, or worse. Silk cords ended many such stories quietly. Officially, they vanished. In reality, they were reminders to the rest. Obedience was not optional, and yet, from the outside, European observers sometimes envied the Devshirme boys. They are given the best education, some remarked. They dine better than peasants in their villages. True, the food was richer, the clothes finer, but what those observers missed was the cost. Freedom, identity, humanity. Imagine eating honey cakes on a silver platter, knowing you can never again taste bread baked by your mother's hands. Luxury loses its sweetness when it's laced with loss. Life in the harem for Devshirme concubines carried layers of contradiction. You slept on embroidered cushions but under constant surveillance. You learned to recite verses of love poetry, knowing your own heart could never choose. You walked among gardens where tulips bloomed, yet you weren't allowed to step beyond the palace gates. The paradox gnawed at you until you barely knew who you were. A boy from a Balkan village or a servant of empire. The palace wanted you to forget the first answer and accept only the second. Some did forget. Over time, concubines began to identify with the palace more than with their lost families. They became defenders of the system, believing their survival depended on loyalty. They sneered at newcomers who wept for their mothers. They whispered in Turkish instead of their native tongues. They punished those who resisted. The system was so thorough that it turned victims into enforcers, perpetuating itself generation after generation. The psychological toll was staggering. You never knew whether to fear more the Sultan's indifference or the eunuch's attention. At night, boys whispered about escape, but the labyrinth of walls and guards made it impossible. Even if you scaled the gates, you had nowhere to go. Villages forgot names, families assumed death. You weren't just trapped physically, you were erased from memory. And isn't that the creepiest prison of all? The one where even your absence goes unnoticed? What made the Devshirme system uniquely terrifying was its regularity. Kidnapping felt chaotic, slave markets noisy. But Devshirme was methodical, predictable, even bureaucratic. Villages marked calendars with dread. Children grew up knowing that one day strangers might ride in and claim them as the Sultan's due. That predictability deepened the terror. It wasn't random fate, it was state policy. It was ritualized theft, dressed in the garb of legitimacy. And for you, standing now in the dormitory under the gaze of eunuchs, the truth weighs heavy. You are one of thousands taken not by chance, but by design. The Empire has folded your life into its machinery, as neatly as a name written in a ledger. The corridors you walk, the silks you wear, the songs you sing, they all begin with the echo of hooves in a Balkan village, the moment a hand pointed at you and sealed your fate. The walls of Topkapi no longer feel strange to you. Their mosaics glitter under lamplight, fountains murmur in hidden courtyards, and from afar the domes shimmer like they were set by the hands of angels. But you've learned not to trust the beauty. It is decoration on a cage, one that grows tighter with every passing day. For male concubines brought here, the next phase after capture or conscription was training, an ordeal of isolation designed to reshape you completely. You weren't just being taught skills, you were being broken, moulded into something useful, obedient and unrecognizable from the child you once were. Training began the very first morning after arrival. At dawn, the sound of iron doors unlocking jolted you awake. A eunuch's voice barked commands in Turkish, sharp syllables that you only half understood. You stumbled into line with the others, your body still sore from the long march or the rough cot. Meals were basic. Flatbread, a bit of broth, sometimes olives if fortune favoured you. Eat quickly. Don't speak. Don't look around. From the very start, silence was hammered into you as a virtue. The curriculum was as much about control as education. On one level, you were given lessons in reading, writing, music, calligraphy and poetry. Ottoman rulers prided themselves on surrounding themselves with cultured servants, so you were expected to become not just a body, but also an entertainer, a scholar, a refined ornament. But beneath the polish ran a deeper training. How to move, how to bow, how to suppress every instinct of freedom. You learned to fold yourself small when higher ranks passed, to keep your eyes lowered, to anticipate orders without being told. Obedience wasn't just expected, it was rehearsed until it became reflex. Isolation was the real weapon. Concubines were separated from the outside world entirely. No letters, no visits, no glimpses of familiar landscapes. The palace became your universe. Dormitories, training halls, courtyards, you saw nothing else. Some boys resisted at first, clinging to memories of family. They whispered their mothers' names at night, traced imaginary maps of their home villages on the stone floors. But the longer you stayed, the fainter those memories grew. After months, even the sound of your native language began to feel foreign, like a half-forgotten dream. The palace wanted you to lose your past because loyalty to the Sultan required having no ties left anywhere else. One of the most unsettling aspects of training was how much it blurred pain and privilege. You slept in orderly rows, under watch, but the linens were cleaner than those of most peasants outside. You were fed regularly, though strictly. You were bathed in marble hammams, perfumed with oils, and clothed in silks. Yet none of it belonged to you. Every cushion, every robe, every bite of bread was a reminder that you existed only because someone else allowed it. The luxury was a leash, velvet wrapped around your throat. The eunuchs ran everything with brutal efficiency. They divided concubines into groups by age and talent. Some were drilled in music, learning the haunting notes of the ney flute or the rhythmic patterns of the tambour. Others practiced reciting Ottoman poetry, memorizing verses to soothe the Sultan during long nights. A few, the most beautiful, were trained in the art of conversation, learning to flatter, to charm, to anticipate moods. None of it was for your sake. Every lesson was designed for the pleasure and control of someone above you. And let's not forget the punishments woven into this education. Fail to memorize your lines, a beating, spill sherbet on a cushion, a night without food, whisper in your native tongue. Days in isolation, locked in a windowless room where silence pressed heavier than chains. The discipline was constant, unpredictable. Some boys broke quickly, their spirits folding like paper. Others resisted quietly, obeying outwardly while clinging to scraps of identity and secret thoughts. But even those secret rebellions wore down eventually. The palace was patient. It could wait years to erase you. The creepiness lay not only in the punishments, but in the rewards. A boy who excelled in music might be praised, given extra food, or even paraded before the Sultan. Imagine the thrill, being noticed, chosen, singled out from the faceless mass. But that thrill was dangerous. The moment you tasted favour, you knew it could vanish tomorrow. You lived in a constant cycle of hope and dread, like a moth drawn to a flame that could burn you alive at any second. What truly unsettled the new arrivals was the hierarchy among concubines themselves. Older boys, already conditioned, often acted as mentors, but their mentorship came laced with cruelty. They enforced discipline even harsher than eunuchs sometimes, mocking, humiliating, or punishing the younger ones. Not because they enjoyed it, though some did, but because it was the only way to protect themselves. By becoming enforcers, they avoided becoming targets. The system was clever. It didn't just isolate you from the outside world, it turned you against each other, weaving mistrust and fear into the very fabric of your daily life. Training also had an eerie ritualistic quality. Days were structured down to the minute, with bells signalling when to eat, when to train, when to pray, when to sleep. There was no space for spontaneity, no room for choice. The monotony was deliberate. When every moment is dictated, you forget how to decide for yourself. After months of this, you caught yourself standing in line without thinking, bowing before you realized you'd bowed. It wasn't training anymore, it was conditioning. And then came the performances. After months of drills, boys were presented before higher officials in stage displays. Dressed in bright silks, faces scrubbed, they sang, danced, or recited poetry, while eunuchs looked on coldly. The officials judged them like livestock again. This one has promise, that one is useless, this one is suitable for the Sultan's notice. Those deemed unworthy might be reassigned to hard labour or discarded quietly. For the chosen, the path ahead looked gilded, but gilded in the way a cage is gilded. Isolation didn't just strip you of family, it stripped you of self. The palace flooded you with new names, new languages, new beliefs. Circumcision rituals marked your body. Conversion lessons reshaped your prayers. By the time you were 16, you weren't the boy taken from a village anymore. You were something else, a reflection of the Sultan's will, and yet deep down there lingered a hollow space, a reminder that you once belonged elsewhere. That emptiness was the creepiest part of all, being turned into a stranger to yourself. What's striking is how this training mirrored military indoctrination but with a sinister twist. Janissaries were taught loyalty to fight and die in battle. Concubines were taught loyalty to serve and disappear in silence. Both systems required breaking boys down, but concubinage added layers of intimacy, control, and secrecy. It wasn't just about making you obey orders. It was about making you surrender your very will, until even your dreams carried the Sultan's shadow. At night, lying in your dormitory, you could hear the soft whimpers of others. Some whispered prayers in languages they weren't supposed to remember. Others stared blankly at the ceiling, already hollowed out by submission. The air smelled of sweat, oil, and rosewater, a strange blend of humanity and artifice. You closed your eyes, but the routines of the day replayed in your head. The bowing, the memorization, the punishments. Even in sleep you couldn't escape. There's a chilling thought that drifts through your mind. Perhaps this was the point. To make you so accustomed to control that you stopped noticing it. To make obedience feel natural, like breathing. The palace wasn't just training concubines, it was manufacturing them, stamping out individuality until all that remained was function. And here's the cruel irony. From the outside, travellers sometimes described the palace as a paradise of youth and beauty. They saw boys in fine silks, heard the music, admired the polished manners. They didn't see the fear behind lowered eyes, the trembling hands holding trays, the nightmares woven into the silence. To them, it looked like a dream. To you, it was a nightmare that pretended to be one. So, the training continued day after day, year after year, until the boy you once were faded into memory. You learned the right songs, the right words, the right movements. You smiled when ordered, bowed when commanded, and silenced your heart whenever it dared to whisper rebellion. And as you lay awake, listening to the fountains trickle outside, you realized the truth. Isolation hadn't just trained you, it had remade you. By now you understand the drills, the etiquette, the endless routines of bowing and silence. But the palace had another layer of control, one that seeped not into your body but into your mind. Training in obedience was one thing, psychological conditioning was another. The Ottomans knew that fear could do what whips and rods never could. Reach into your thoughts and change them until you began to police yourself. For male concubines, this was the most unsettling part of life inside those walls. The creeping realization that even your own mind was no longer safe. From the first days of training, concubines were placed under constant surveillance. The black eunuchs, those watchful guardians of the harem, didn't just supervise. They studied. Every look, every hesitation, every slip of the tongue was noted. Their eyes seemed everywhere, lurking in shadows during prayer, lingering at the edge of the bathhouse, even peering into the dormitories at night. You learned quickly that privacy did not exist. If you whispered too loudly to another boy, a eunuch appeared. If you lingered too long staring out of a window, a eunuch coughed behind you. The palace was a living organism, and its immune system was vigilance. The result was paranoia. You began to censor your own thoughts. Before you spoke, you considered, will this offend? Will this be reported? Before you sighed, you wondered, will someone interpret it as defiance? Eventually, you stopped needing eunuchs to correct you. You corrected yourself. That was the genius and horror of psychological conditioning. The leash no longer needed to be pulled tight, because you learned to choke yourself with it. Punishments reinforced this self-censorship. Sometimes they were physical, beatings, whippings, deprivation. But often they were designed to terrify. A boy caught breaking rules might be paraded before others and humiliated, forced to crawl or kneel for hours. Another might be locked in a small chamber, fed only bread and water, left to stew in silence until his thoughts turned against him. The fear spread like smoke. Even if you weren't punished, you felt it when you saw someone else punished. That was enough to keep you quiet. There were also staged lessons. Eunuchs sometimes dragged disobedient concubines into courtyards and beat them in front of everyone else, not because the crime demanded it, but because the performance reinforced the hierarchy. It was theatre, a grim play where you were both audience and potential actor. The message was clear: step out of line, and this will be you. Fear became not just an emotion but a daily companion, sitting beside you at meals, lying down with you on your thin mat at night. Psychological conditioning didn't stop with fear. It also used manipulation. Concubines were praised one day and ignored the next, lifted up then cast down. A sultan's smile could make you feel chosen, but his silence the next day could unmake you completely. That inconsistency destabilized you. You never knew where you stood, so you clung to obedience, desperate to avoid falling out of favour. It was like walking on a bridge of glass, never sure if the next step would hold or shatter beneath you. Even the use of luxury played into this manipulation. Imagine being bathed in perfumed water, clothed in silks, fed sweet sherbets, and then, without warning, thrown back into hunger and filth as punishment. The contrast was deliberate. Comfort made punishment harsher, and punishment made comfort sweeter. You learned to crave approval because it was the only way to secure moments of relief. The palace controlled you not only through pain but also through the dangling of pleasure. The strangest part was how concubines began turning on each other. The system encouraged it. Eunuchs rewarded boys who reported disobedience, who spied on their peers. Friendships became dangerous. You never knew if the boy you whispered to at night would repeat your words in exchange for a favour. Trust corroded. You stopped speaking freely, even to those who seemed closest. Isolation deepened, not just from the outside world, but from those lying beside you in the dormitory. You lived surrounded by others, yet utterly alone. Religion added another layer of psychological control. Daily prayers, Quranic recitations, rituals. These weren't optional. They were drilled into you, not just as faith, but as discipline. To disobey wasn't merely to break rules, it was to sin. Disobedience became framed as both treason to the Sultan and rebellion against God. That combination was powerful. Even if your heart longed for freedom, your mind whispered that freedom was damnation. Over time, many concubines internalized the idea that their suffering was destiny, perhaps even divine will. The palace also exploited uncertainty as a weapon. No one told you your future. Would you serve food forever? Would you be chosen for intimacy? Would you be discarded? The not knowing gnawed at you. Sometimes a eunuch summoned boys at night, and they never returned. Whispers spread, strangled, drowned, reassigned. The mystery made it worse. If you knew your punishment, you could brace yourself. Not knowing left you in constant suspense, a slow drip of dread that never stopped. Here's a creepy detail. Sometimes concubines were deliberately given conflicting instructions. One superior told you to sing, another told you to stay silent. Obeying one meant disobeying the other. Whatever you did, you failed. The point wasn't fairness, it was control. By keeping you off balance, they reminded you that you couldn't win. Obedience wasn't about logic, it was about submission, even when it made no sense. And then there were the tests eunuchs occasionally spread rumours. The Sultan is displeased with someone, or a traitor will be punished. Suddenly everyone was on edge, scanning each other, wondering who would be taken. Sometimes no one was punished at all. The rumour itself was enough. Other times, a completely innocent boy was chosen, just to prove that innocence offered no shield. These psychological games warped your sense of justice until you stopped expecting it altogether. The conditioning worked its way even into dreams. Concubines described waking in the night, heart pounding, certain they'd heard footsteps or a door creak. Some dreamed of their families but woke unable to picture their faces clearly. Others dreamed of escape, only to jolt awake sweating, terrified that even the thought might be discovered. Sleep itself became another battlefield, where the mind wrestled with fear long after the eunuchs had locked the doors. There's something especially unsettling about the way this conditioning blurred kindness and cruelty. Eunuch might smile at you, hand you an extra portion of food, or praise your bowing posture. You felt relief, maybe even gratitude. But you knew the same eunuch could beat you tomorrow. That unpredictability bound you tighter than chains. You began to cling to even false kindness, grateful for crumbs of approval. It was survival by submission, gratitude for the hand that struck you simply because sometimes it didn't. Over time, the line between fear and obedience disappeared. You stopped asking yourself whether you wanted to obey. You simply did. You bowed. You served. You smiled on command. You even corrected others, snapping at newcomers who broke rules, because their mistakes threatened your fragile safety too. The conditioning was complete when you no longer needed eunuchs to watch you. You became your own guard, your own censor, your own jailer. From the outside, it might seem incredible that boys accepted this, but the brilliance of the system was that it didn't demand sudden submission. It chipped away slowly, day by day, until resistance felt impossible. By the time you realised how much of yourself you'd lost, there wasn't enough left of you to fight. You were a shadow, a servant whose chains weren't on the wrists but in the mind. And that perhaps was the creepiest thing of all. Beatings left bruises, stranglings left corpses, but psychological conditioning left nothing visible. To visitors you looked calm, elegant, obedient. No one saw the erosion inside. The palace had found a way to hollow boys out, to turn them into vessels that carried not their own will, but the will of the Sultan. And when you walked through the halls in silence, eyes lowered, steps measured, you realised you weren't just surviving in the palace, you had become part of it. Rules, routines, drills, those were suffocating enough. But where the palace's grip turned especially sinister was in its obsession with controlling desire. For the male concubines, every impulse of affection, every flicker of longing was monitored, judged, and punished. You weren't simply forbidden from love, you were forbidden from even appearing to want it, and if you slipped, the consequences were brutal. From the very start of training, eunuchs hammered home the warning, no attachments. You could not form close friendships with other concubines. You could not show favouritism. You could not whisper too long to the same boy. Even laughter shared at the wrong time could draw suspicion. The logic was simple. Attachments bred loyalty outside the Sultan, and the Sultan tolerated no rivals. So every human instinct to bond, to cling to someone in the loneliness, was treated as a crime. The rules weren't vague, they were spelled out in constant reminders. Don't linger at the baths, don't sit side by side for too long in the dormitories, don't exchange gifts, don't touch unless commanded. At first you thought these rules impossible to enforce. How could they know? But the palace was a hive of spies. Boys eager to earn favour whispered what they saw. Eunuchs lingered like shadows, watching from corners. Even walls seemed to have ears. Soon you learned not only to follow the rules, but to bury even the thought of breaking them. But desire has a way of surfacing despite walls and rules. A hand brushed too long while passing a cup. A look held too long in the bathhouse steam. Whispers at night when others slept. For many concubines, these tiny rebellions weren't just about attraction. They were about survival. They were proof you were still human. And yet, each carried enormous risk. If discovered, punishment was swift and merciless. What did punishment look like? Sometimes public humiliation, being beaten while others watched, stripped of fine silks and forced to serve in rags. Other times, exile within the palace, reassignment to the lowest duties, scrubbing latrines until your hands cracked. In harsher cases, concubines were flogged, confined in isolation for weeks, or even executed. Records speak of silk cords tightening around the throats of boys accused of improper attachments. The message was unmistakable. Your body belonged only to the Sultan, your loyalty only to him, and your heart to no one at all. The greatest danger of all was being accused of desiring the Sultan himself in ways unsanctioned. Imagine the paradox. You were trained to serve him intimately, to be available at his whim, yet never to express desire of your own. Any hint that you had longings beyond obedience could be interpreted as insolence. It was the ultimate trap. You existed to please but could never want. If you smiled too warmly, laughed too loudly, or lingered too close, you risked being branded presumptuous, and presumptuous concubines often met an early end. The Sultan's desires were treated as divine. If he summoned you, you obeyed. If he ignored you, you vanished into the dormitories. That asymmetry was deliberate. It reminded you that you had no power, no choice, no voice in intimacy. And if you ever forgot, there were examples all around you. Whispers told of boys strangled after being caught kissing in shadows, of others drowned in the Bosphorus after being accused of conspiring with female concubines. The punishments were stories as much as realities. Cautionary tales whispered in the dark to keep everyone terrified of stepping out of the line. The irony was that the system created a hypercharged environment of desire even while forbidding it. The palace was filled with young boys, isolated from families, trained in beauty and elegance, dressed in silks, their very bodies commodified. To deny that impulses flickered was to deny human nature. And the Ottomans knew this. That's why they made the rules so strict. They didn't expect to erase desire, only to weaponize its suppression. Every concubine carried the weight of wanting but fearing, needing but hiding, loving but never daring. Some try to find loopholes, a smile disguised as courtesy, a gift framed as duty, a whispered prayer in the dormitories that sounded like nothing but meant everything. These tiny rebellions kept humanity alive, but they also made you constantly afraid. Was your smile noticed? Was the gift reported? Would the eunuch suddenly appear at night demanding you step outside? Each small risk felt like a gamble with your life. Even music meant to soothe could become suspect. Imagine singing a love poem in training, your voice soft, your eyes closing for a moment too long. If a eunuch decided you meant it for someone other than the Sultan, punishment followed. The art of survival was learning to sing beautifully without ever seeming to feel it, to act grace without truth, to make yourself a mirror reflecting others' desires, never showing your own. What about those who broke the rules anyway? Some concubines clung to each other in secret, building bonds despite the risks. These attachments offered a sense of sanity in an otherwise suffocating life. But discovery was devastating. Both boys might be whipped, starved, or executed. Worse, sometimes only one was punished, leaving the survivor to live with guilt. Eunuchs exploited this ruthlessly, turning affection into a weapon. Do you care for him? They might ask. If you admitted it, you sealed his fate. If you denied it, you betrayed him. Either way, desire ended in suffering. The palace used these stories to cultivate fear. Rumours circulated. A boy drowned in a cistern for touching another's hand. Another strangled with silk for exchanging glances too often. Even if the stories weren't all true, they served their purpose. They kept you in line, made you doubt every gesture. That uncertainty was the true punishment, living each day with the knowledge that even your smallest impulse could kill you. And yet, the cruelest part was how the system twisted natural human needs into guilt. Loneliness was constant. You longed for someone to talk to freely, someone to share fears with. But if you tried, you risked everything. So you learned to suppress not only attraction but also friendship, tenderness, compassion. The palace didn't just deny you intimacy, it denied you connection. That denial hollowed you out until sometimes you wondered if you were human at all. Occasionally a boy was rewarded for exposing others. A eunuch might give him better food, lighter duties, or even a chance to stand closer to the Sultan. Watching another concubine rise because he betrayed a friend was a lesson in itself. Loyalty to peers was worthless. Loyalty to the system was everything. And so, the palace ensured that even the faint hope of solidarity among concubines was crushed. The contradictions were dizzying. You were trained to be beautiful, graceful, desirable, and punished for desiring. You were surrounded by peers, yet forbidden to befriend them. You were watched constantly, yet expected to appear serene, cultured, and unbothered. The palace created a nightmare of contradictions where survival meant twisting yourself into something unrecognizable. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the eunuch's footsteps echoed away, you sometimes let your mind wander. You thought about a hand you'd brushed in passing, a glance you'd stolen. These tiny rebellions replayed in your mind like treasures. But even in your thoughts, fear intruded. You asked yourself, what if even thinking this is dangerous? What if God hears and punishes me? What if somehow, in ways I can't imagine, the palace knows? That paranoia turned even dreams into prisons. What makes this entire system so creepy isn't just the punishments. It's the way it warped love itself. For concubines, love wasn't joy. It was risk. Desire wasn't natural. It was dangerous. Connection wasn't comfort. It was betrayal waiting to happen. The palace redefined the most basic human instincts until they became weapons against you. And as years passed, some boys forgot what it felt like to long freely. They learned to live without hope of affection, their hearts trained into silence as surely as their bodies were trained into obedience. So, you drifted through corridors gilded with gold, fountains whispering in marble courtyards, yet carrying a hollow where your heart should have been. You laughed when commanded, sang when summoned, bowed when required. But beneath it all lay a constant dread, the knowledge that your humanity, your need to love, to want, to belong, was the most dangerous secret of all. The palace feels different when night falls. The daytime bustle of eunuchs barking orders, Concubines shuffling in lines and officials passing through echoing corridors fades into something heavier, quieter, almost suffocating. Torches flicker against carved marble, casting shadows that seem too long for the rooms that contain them. This is when the Sultan's private world awakens, and when male concubines like you are most vulnerable. For beyond the grand public halls lies a labyrinth of secret chambers, tucked away behind heavy doors and veiled passageways where the Sultan kept his most personal companions. And among those companions were the chosen few, male concubines singled out for his exclusive use. These chambers weren't marked on maps, and visitors to the palace never saw them. They were intentionally hidden, designed so that even high-ranking officials could not stumble across them. A gilded arch here, a narrow corridor there, then suddenly a chamber draped in silks, perfumed with incense, and silent except for the faint trickle of a fountain. The air inside was cooler, scented with rosewater and musk, heavy with the awareness that you were somewhere forbidden to most. Only the Sultan and those he summoned ever passed these thresholds. To be chosen for such a chamber was a double-edged fate. On one hand, it meant survival, at least temporarily. You weren't just another nameless boy in a dormitory. You had been noticed. You were fed better, dressed more finely, and treated with a kind of false gentleness. Your hair might be combed with oils, your body perfumed, your silks embroidered. But that attention came with a price. You were no longer just a servant. You were property more intimate than furniture, more disposable than jewels. Imagine the moment of summons. A eunuch enters the dormitory, his voice low but commanding. You. Come, every boy freezes. His finger points at you. Your stomach twists. The others avert their eyes, some with envy, others with pity. You follow, heart pounding, feet echoing on stone. Each step takes you deeper into the Sultan's private world, away from the thin safety of anonymity. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere is unnerving. Cushions embroidered with gold thread line the floors. Lamps cast soft glows, making the room feel dreamlike, almost unreal. But beneath the beauty lies tension. You're told to sit, to play music, to recite poetry. Sometimes the Sultan asks for conversation. Sometimes he asks for silence. Sometimes he demands more. Whatever he wants, you give. Not because you choose to, but because choice no longer exists. The Sultan's moods were unpredictable. One evening he might be indulgent, laughing, generous, pressing sweets into your hands, listening to your song. The next he might be cold, distant, or furious at some invisible slight. You lived in constant suspense, never sure whether you'd be rewarded with a kind word or dismissed forever. That volatility was part of the control. It kept you on edge, reminding you that favour was fleeting and could vanish in a heartbeat. Some concubines were kept in these private apartments for weeks, months, even years, becoming fixtures in the Sultan's personal life. They learned his routines, his moods, his secrets. They knew which songs soothed him, which stories amused him, which silences meant danger. In a strange way, they became confidants, though never equals. You were trusted enough to share his private hours, but never trusted enough to matter beyond them. But just as easily you could be replaced. The palace ensured a steady supply of new boys, fresh faces drawn from villages and markets. The Sultan's preferences shifted like the tides. Today he favoured you, tomorrow he might not. And when that shift came, the change was brutal. One day you lounged on embroidered cushions, sipping sherbet. The next you were back in the dormitory, stripped of silks, ignored as if you had never existed. For some, dismissal meant survival. For others, it was the prelude to disappearance. The secrecy surrounding these chambers added another layer of unease. Other concubines speculated constantly about what happened inside, but no one dared to ask directly. Rumours spread like wildfire. Some boys were treated like princes, others like pets, still others like playthings discarded too soon. These stories fueled both envy and terror. Envy, because proximity to the Sultan meant potential influence. Terror, because that same proximity meant danger of sudden death. The chambers were not just private, they were unpredictable, a place where a single misstep could end everything. And there were rules within these private apartments, stricter than anywhere else. You could never speak first unless spoken to. You could never look the Sultan directly in the eyes unless commanded. You could never show hesitation. Everything about your body, your posture, your gestures, your tone was regulated. The smallest error might be seen as disrespect. Disrespect, even unintended, could be punished not only with dismissal, but with strangulation by the silk cord kept close at hand. What unsettles most is how intimacy became institutionalized. In theory, these chambers should have been spaces of closeness, of trust. In reality, they were stages. You were an actor performing a role, your emotions scripted by fear. The Sultan might laugh with you, but the laughter wasn't mutual. He might share food with you, but the meal wasn't shared. Everything was one-sided, dictated by his whims, your humanity erased beneath the mask of obedience. And yet, in those moments of forced closeness, you sometimes felt flickers of confusion. A kind word, a soft touch, a rare smile, they unsettled you more than cruelty did. Cruelty was predictable, kindness made you hope, and hope was dangerous. It made you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you could matter. That hope bound you tighter than any chain. Because the day it vanished, you fell twice as hard, left hollow and broken. There were darker whispers too, rumours of chambers where concubines were tested, humiliated, or made to endure lessons in loyalty. Some spoke of boys forced to betray each other in front of the Sultan, proving their obedience by denouncing friends. Others told of games designed to amuse at concubines' expense, games where fear and desire blurred. Whether all of these tales were true is hard to know, but in the palace, rumour carried weight. Fear didn't need proof. The eunuchs controlled the logistics of these encounters. They escorted you in, waited outside, and escorted you out. Their faces betrayed nothing, but everyone knew they reported back, ensuring the Sultan's commands were carried out, ensuring no word of what happened inside ever leaked. The secrecy was ironclad. Even if you wanted to tell, there was no one to tell, nowhere to go. Silence became your prison, as binding as the walls themselves. And here lies the eeriest truth. Some boys, after years in these chambers, forgot how to live without them. They became so conditioned to the Sultan's attention that dismissal shattered them. Back in the dormitories, stripped of favour, they withered. Some sank into despair, others into madness. A few begged to be killed rather than live in anonymity again. The system was so thorough it didn't just control your life, it rewired your sense of self until you could not imagine existing without its grip. From the outside, travellers and diplomats sometimes hinted at these hidden chambers, though never openly. They spoke of favourites, of pages, of companions. The language was vague, softened for polite audiences, but behind those words lay a reality as sharp as any blade. Boys lived and died in those secret rooms, their fates tied to the whims of one man, their humanity dissolved into silence. Walking through those corridors now in your imagination, you can almost hear the echoes, the soft laughter forced from trembling lips, the splash of sherbet poured into golden cups, the muffled sobs when doors closed, and always the heavy silence that followed, swallowing everything until only shadows remained. So, when you think of the Sultan's grandeur, the golden domes, the shimmering tiles, the endless parades of soldiers, remember this too. Hidden behind those public displays were private chambers where boys lived as ghosts, chosen, pampered, silenced, discarded. Their names erased, their stories untold, and somewhere in the cold stone of those walls their presence still lingers, a reminder that the heart of empire was built not only on conquest and wealth, but on secrets too dark to ever appear in official chronicles. By now you've seen how capture, training, surveillance, and the Sultan's secret chambers all worked together to strip a concubine of his freedom. But there was another layer to the palace's twisted machine: politics. Male concubines weren't just bodies to entertain or serve, they were pawns in an endless game of intrigue. In the Ottoman court, where whispers were as deadly as swords, concubines became tools of manipulation, spies for powerful figures, and scapegoats when plots unravelled. You weren't simply trapped in silk, you were tangled in a web of schemes you could never fully escape. First, consider your position. You lived closer to the Sultan than almost anyone else. Ministers, generals, and even viziers needed audiences with him. You, on the other hand, might pour his sherbet, sing his poetry, or sit quietly while he spoke his thoughts aloud. That proximity made you dangerous, not because you wanted power, but because others knew you had access to it. Your ears became valuable, your tongue even more so. Eunuchs understood this perfectly. They often used concubines as their informants. A eunuch might whisper, "Tell me what he said last night, and I'll see you get better food." Another might demand, "Repeat his mood during the feast, or you'll be punished." You had no choice. Refuse, and you risked a beating or worse. Obey, and you risked the Sultan discovering your disloyalty. Either way, you were trapped. Every word you heard became a potential weapon, and you never knew who was aiming it. Sometimes you were sent as a spy deliberately. A vizier might slip a eunuch a bribe, and suddenly you were assigned to serve sherbet during a council meeting. Your job wasn't only to carry the cup, but to listen. Who argued with whom? Which general seemed nervous? Which pasha looked dissatisfied? Later, in the quiet of a private chamber, you were questioned. What did you hear? What did you see? You repeated everything, careful not to embellish, careful not to omit. Because in the palace, too much detail was suspicious, and too little was also suspicious. But the danger didn't end there. Information could be twisted. Suppose you reported that the Sultan seemed distracted. That small comment might be inflated into rumours of illness, weakness, vulnerability. Suddenly factions stirred. The vizier you'd spoken to used your words to plot. If the Sultan learned the rumour started with you, even unintentionally, you became the scapegoat. And scapegoats didn't live long. There were other forms of exploitation too. Concubines sometimes became bargaining chips in the rivalries between the female harem and the male hierarchy. The Valida Sultan, the Sultan's mother, wielded enormous influence. So did his favoured consorts. These women understood that the Sultan's male companions could be manipulated, bribed, or removed. If a male concubine grew too close to the Sultan, jealousy brewed. The Valida might pressure a eunuch to reassign the boy. Sometimes reassignment meant menial labour. Sometimes it meant a midnight strangling. Imagine being caught in the middle of that invisible war. The Sultan's mother suspected you of distracting her son. His favourite concubine spread whispers that you were insolent. The eunuchs debated whether you were useful. You went about your duties, heart pounding, never knowing which shadow hid the hand that would end you. It wasn't always your mistakes that doomed you. Sometimes it was simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, chosen as the sacrificial lamb to protect someone more powerful. Even foreign ambassadors played into this game. They knew the palace had layers of secrecy, and sometimes gifts meant for the Sultan slipped instead into the hands of his favourites. A jewelled dagger, a pouch of coins, a silk robe. These weren't just luxuries. They were tests. If you accepted, you risked being branded a traitor. If you refused, you angered those who could protect you. Again, you had no choice that wasn't dangerous. What's especially chilling is how disposable concubines were in this system. Ministers, generals, viziers. They were known figures, their power recorded. Concubines, by contrast, left little trace. That made them perfect scapegoats. If a scandal erupted, if a message leaked, if a decision went wrong, a concubine could be blamed, punished, and erased without consequence. He acted alone, officials would say. He was disloyal. The truth rarely mattered. The palace needed someone to bleed, and concubines bled easily. This exploitation seeped into daily life. Imagine being ordered to deliver a sealed message, knowing it might contain words of treason. You carried it anyway. What else could you do? Later, when the message surfaced, your hands were blamed. You swore you didn't know, but the silk cord didn't care. That's the terrifying part. You could be punished not for what you did, but for what others did through you. The psychological toll was immense. Every word you heard, every glance you noticed, felt heavy. Should you repeat it? Should you stay silent? Either choice could doom you. You learned to measure your speech carefully, to weigh every syllable before it left your mouth. Even silence became dangerous if it suggested you were hiding something. In time, you stopped trusting yourself, second-guessing every action. The palace had made you into a permanent suspect, guilty of survival itself, and yet some concubines managed to exploit this role to their advantage. A few became trusted informants, valued for their discretion. They learned to balance competing factions, feeding each just enough to appear useful, but never so much as to be incriminated. These boys sometimes rose in influence, commanding wealth or positions in the palace bureaucracy, but their lives remained precarious. One miscalculation, one careless slip, and they fell faster than they rose. What's eerie is how normal this all seemed inside the palace. To the outside world, concubines were symbols of decadence, whispered about as playthings. Inside, they were cogs in a ruthless political machine. The harem wasn't just about pleasure, it was about control, leverage, and espionage. And male concubines, invisible to most of history, were often at the heart of it. At night, lying on your mat, you felt the weight of this duplicity. By day, you smiled, bowed, recited poetry. By night you replayed every word you'd spoken, every look you'd given, wondering if one of them would be your undoing. Fear hollowed you out until you barely recognized yourself. You weren't living, you were surviving one whispered rumour at a time, and sometimes survival wasn't enough. You woke to the sound of footsteps in the dormitory, a eunuch's shadow falling across your face. A quiet voice ordered you to rise. You followed into the darkness, knowing the others wouldn't see you again. Your fate had been sealed not by your own actions, but by the invisible web of politics that always needed another sacrifice. This was the ultimate horror of the system, that you weren't simply a servant, or even just a prisoner. You were a pawn in games too vast to understand, games where your life was expendable, your suffering unremarkable. And when the palace erased you, it did so without hesitation, confident that another boy would take your place by morning. So, when you picture the Ottoman court, the glittering domes, the jewelled thrones, the dazzling parades, remember too the shadows. Behind every feast, every council, every triumph, there were concubines caught in schemes they could never escape, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to whispers in the dark. And if you listen closely, you might still hear them, voices trembling with secrets, begging not to be the next pawn sacrificed to the Empire's endless hunger for control. By now you can sense that the palace was not merely a gilded cage for isolated boys. It was a theatre of competition. And perhaps the sharpest rivalries came not between eunuchs and concubines, but between the male concubines and the women of the imperial harem. The world imagines Ottoman harems as filled only with jewelled odalisques lounging on cushions, yet the truth was far more complex. Inside those walls, female concubines and male concubines shared the same suffocating space of servitude, but their roles collided in ways that bred jealousy, suspicion, and outright conflict. You weren't just competing for survival, you were competing for the Sultan's attention, and that made the palace a battlefield of desire. The imperial harem housed hundreds of women, some brought as captives from across the empire, others offered as gifts, still others raised within the palace itself. Like the boys, they were trained in music, poetry, and obedience. Their purpose was clear: to serve the Sultan and, crucially, to produce heirs. That biological role gave them an advantage male concubines could never match. But it also meant they saw you, beautiful, perfumed, silken-clad, as a threat. You were a reminder that the Sultan's desires did not always align with the politics of succession. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, often acted as the ultimate power in this rivalry. She controlled the female harem with an iron grip, ensuring that her influence over her son remained unchallenged. A male concubine who became too favoured risked her wrath. She saw you as a distraction, an indulgence that weakened the dynasty. Whispers from her could seal your fate, turning a moment of favour into a death sentence. Imagine knowing that even when the Sultan smiled at you, his mother's glare might already be planning your removal. Female concubines too saw the danger. A woman who bore the Sultan a son could rise to extraordinary influence. But if the Sultan turned his attention toward male companions, her chances diminished. Jealousy brewed in silk-draped chambers. Women whispered among themselves, plotting ways to diminish you. A misplaced rumour here, a false accusation there. It was enough to stain your reputation. Once suspicion took hold, the eunuchs had all the excuse they needed to dispose of you. The palace became a game of perception. If you seemed too close to the Sultan, women grew jealous. If you seemed indifferent, eunuchs grew suspicious. You balanced on a razor's edge, constantly adjusting your behaviour. Too much laughter risked envy. Too much silence risked invisibility. Each gesture became a calculation, each word a gamble. There were moments when rivalry turned openly cruel. Stories whisper of women orchestrating humiliations for male concubines, slipping oils on floors to cause falls during dances, spreading lies that boys had stolen jewels, even bribing eunuchs to discover fabricated offences. Punishments followed swiftly, and the women smiled from behind their veils as another rival was dragged away. These acts weren't petty. They were survival tactics in a world where only one's proximity to the Sultan guaranteed security. At the same time, you saw echoes of yourself in them. The women were trapped too, isolated from the outside world, subjected to training, watched by eunuchs. Their rivalries mirrored your own fears, their jealousies born of desperation. Sometimes, in quiet moments, a concubine might exchange a glance with a woman that wasn't hostile but mournful. Both of you were prisoners of the same gilded cage, forced to claw at each other instead of at the system that bound you. Yet sympathy rarely lasted. The harem thrived on division. Female favourites wielded real power because they could bear children. Male concubines, incapable of such, were always at risk of erasure. And so you felt the tension constantly. They feared you as a distraction, while you feared them as competitors who could weaponize their wombs. It was a rivalry written into the very structure of palace life. What made the situation especially chilling was how the Sultan himself exploited it. He allowed the rivalry to fester because it served him. So long as women and boys competed for his favour, they never united against him. He became the sun around which all of you revolved, the centre of gravity pulling you into endless competition. His whims determined your worth, his silences determined your despair, and as long as you fought each other, his control remained absolute. There were also moments when the rivalry turned violent. Records are scarce, but whispers tell of fights in the baths, poisoned sherbets, or sudden illnesses that struck down concubines too quickly to be coincidence. Was it a jealous woman's hand, a eunuch acting on her orders, or simply the cruel hand of fate? You never knew, and that uncertainty was enough to keep you trembling. Even your meals became suspect, every bite a question of whether envy had spiced it with death. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of these rivalries was how they erased individuality. You weren't you. You were the boy. She wasn't herself. She was the favoured concubine. Both sides became archetypes, reduced to roles defined entirely by how the Sultan saw you. And because he was fickle, your value could rise or fall overnight. Yesterday you mattered. Today you didn't. Tomorrow you might not exist at all. The eunuchs thrived in this environment, manipulating tensions to maintain control. They whispered to women about boys, to boys about women, fueling suspicion. The more you fought each other, the stronger their authority grew. Sometimes they deliberately misreported words or staged incidents to provoke jealousy. A misplaced scarf in the wrong chamber, a rumour of a smile exchanged. Each spark fanned into flames, consuming another concubine in the smoke of suspicion. At night, in the dormitories, you heard the whispers of what happened in the women's chambers. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes weeping, sometimes silence too heavy to be normal. You realised they lived in fear just as you did. But instead of solidarity, the system ensured you remained rivals. Their fear was turned against you, and your fear against them. It was a masterpiece of psychological control, dividing those equally oppressed so they never rose together. Occasionally a male concubine and a female concubine did form a secret bond. A glance exchanged in passing, a word whispered through the latticework of a courtyard, a clandestine meeting in a shadowed hallway. These rare connections carried enormous risk, for discovery meant certain death. Yet the fact they happened at all shows how desperate both sides were for human connection. Two prisoners finding solace in each other, even for a fleeting moment. But more often than not, those moments ended in tragedy, with both participants disappearing overnight. So, you lived caught between envy and fear, the weight of rivalry pressing as heavily as the walls around you. You could not trust the women. They could not trust you. Both of you were pawns in a game orchestrated by eunuchs and sultan alike, designed to keep you divided, obedient, and silent. What makes this especially haunting is how thoroughly it worked. For centuries, the palace thrived on this system, feeding on rivalry like fuel. Hundreds of boys and women lived and died within its walls, clawing at each other for scraps of favour, never realising that the true enemy was not each other, but the machine itself. And so, the rivalry with female concubines became another chain binding you. Not iron, not silk, but suspicion. A chain that made you fear every glance, every smile, every whisper. A chain that turned potential allies into enemies. A chain so subtle You didn't even see it tightening until you found yourself strangled by it. By now you know that the palace's foundation was built on silence, secrecy, and surveillance. But survival inside Topkapi wasn't just about rules and rivalries. It was about punishment, discipline so harsh it went beyond keeping order and sank into the realm of deliberate terror. For male concubines, punishment wasn't only a response to disobedience, it was a constant reminder that your life could be broken as easily as glass. The Ottomans didn't merely correct mistakes, they turned discipline into theatre, a performance designed to keep every boy trembling. From the moment you entered training, fear of punishment hovered like smoke. A eunuch's raised eyebrow, the snap of his rod against the floor, even the sound of sandals approaching in the night could make your stomach twist. The rules were simple: obey, stay silent, move when commanded. But the reality was that punishment could fall even when you did everything right. Sometimes a boy was beaten simply to remind the others that control was absolute. The unpredictability was the point. It made you live in permanent anxiety. Physical punishments came first. The most common was flogging with rods or whips. Concubines were ordered to strip to the waist, then beaten until their skin burned red. The whips weren't meant to kill, only to scar dignity. You learned to grit your teeth, to stifle your cries, because noise only encouraged the eunuchs to continue. The others were forced to watch, their silence as heavy as the blows. Every strike on his back was a warning to yours. Sometimes punishments took the form of deprivation. No food for days except dry bread. No water in the summer heat. Locked alone in a windowless cell where time blurred into endless dark. Imagine sitting there, the air thick with your own breath, not knowing if hours or days had passed. The isolation broke many boys faster than the whips ever did. They emerged hollow-eyed, quieter, submissive. It wasn't just their bodies that were weakened, it was their will. Then there were humiliations. A concubine who spilled sherbet might be forced to lick it from the floor in front of everyone. One who spoke out of turn could be paraded through the courtyard in rags while others jeered. Eunuchs excelled at these spectacles, turning one boy's disgrace into a lesson for the rest. The shame cut deeper than bruises. It made you fear not just pain, but exposure. The dread of becoming the next example etched itself into your bones. But the darkest punishments weren't physical or public. They were the ones whispered about, the ones carried out in silence. A eunuch entering the dormitory at night, calling a boy's name. He followed quietly, barefoot, heart pounding. He never returned. The next morning his mat was empty. No explanation given, no questions asked. Sometimes the eunuchs left his belongings untouched for days, a chilling reminder that absence could happen to anyone. The rumour said he'd been strangled with silk, drowned in a cistern, or buried in secret. No one knew. That ignorance was the sharpest blade of all. What made punishment especially terrifying was its arbitrariness. A boy might be beaten for laughing too loudly, while another got away with it. One might be executed for disobedience, while another survived worse. There was no clear line, and that uncertainty kept you paralysed. You stopped asking, "What will happen if I break the rules?" and started asking, "What if punishment comes no matter what I do?" The palace didn't need to punish often. It only needed to punish randomly, ensuring every concubine lived with dread. Sometimes punishments were staged like rituals. The eunuchs would gather the concubines in a courtyard, make them kneel in silence, and bring out the condemned. A silk cord was looped around his neck, pulled tight until he fell limp. The body was carried away swiftly, leaving only silence behind. The eunuchs never explained, never lectured. The sight was enough. You knelt there, trembling, realizing it could be you tomorrow. That fear bound you more tightly than chains ever could. Other times, the punishments blended with twisted mercy. A boy might be spared flogging but forced to kneel for hours in prayer, his knees bleeding on stone. Another might be denied sleep, kept awake by guards who shook him whenever his eyes closed. These weren't punishments in the conventional sense. They were manipulations, breaking the body slowly, bending the mind until it cracked. You began to wonder whether death might be kinder. The psychological punishments were subtler but no less devastating. Eunuchs whispered false rumours to test loyalty. "We know you planned to run," or "Your friend betrayed you." Boys turned on each other, desperate to prove innocence. Others sank into despair, convinced they were doomed no matter what. This paranoia spread like a poison. Even when no punishment came, the fear itself was punishment enough. The cruelest punishments targeted dignity. A boy stripped of his fine silks, shaved bald, assigned to clean latrines. Another forced to serve the lowest slaves, reminded every hour of his fall from favour. In the palace, humiliation was as effective as violence. It reminded you that status meant nothing, that a single command could erase all you'd been trained to be. You could spend years learning poetry, music, etiquette, then lose it all in one mistake, reduced to filth. And here's the haunting truth. Concubines often punished themselves in anticipation. Afraid of mistakes, they bowed lower, moved slower, silenced themselves before speaking. They whipped their own minds into obedience, sparing the eunuchs the effort. The system didn't just enforce punishment, it made you live inside it, a prisoner carrying the lash in your own head. What made the whole structure creepier was its secrecy from the outside world. Diplomats visiting Istanbul saw glittering ceremonies, lavish feasts, golden domes. They never saw the punishments in the courtyards, the disappearances in the night. To them, the palace was a marvel. To you, it was a place where silence wasn't peace but fear, where every step echoed with the memory of screams muffled by pillows. There were whispers, too, of creative cruelties, of boys locked in cages overnight, displayed as warnings, of others forced to carry heavy stones until their arms gave out. Some stories may have been exaggerated, but their power was real. Rumours themselves became punishments, infecting your imagination, making you dread things you'd never even seen. At night, lying on your mat, you replayed the punishments you'd witnessed. The whip cracking across a boy's back, the silk cord tightening, the silence afterward. You asked yourself, when will it be me? You tried to stay still, to breathe softly, as if by making yourself invisible you could escape notice. But invisibility was no guarantee. In the palace, notice and neglect both carried danger. The system thrived because punishment wasn't just discipline. It was performance, spectacle, rumour and fear all braided together. It reminded every boy that he wasn't just serving the Sultan, he was surviving him. And when you bowed the next morning trembling, you knew that obedience wasn't protection, it was merely postponement. So, when you picture the gilded tiles, the jewelled lamps, the fragrant gardens of the Ottoman palace, remember too the darker reality. For every note of music played in the Sultan's chambers, there was a whip's crack in the courtyards. For every sherbet poured into golden cups, there was a boy kneeling in humiliation. For every glittering ceremony, there was a silk cord tightening in silence. And if you had been there, you would have learned the truth. Punishment wasn't the exception in the palace. It was the rule. By now the story has carried you through capture, training, punishments, jealousies and decline. But even when the Ottoman system of male concubinage faded, its shadow lingered. The eerie echoes of those practices live on in history, in whispers that refuse to die, and in the stones of Topkapı Palace itself. You cannot walk those halls even today without feeling the silence pressing on you, the sense that the walls remember. And in these echoes lies the unsettling legacy of what it meant to be a male concubine in the empire. One of the strongest echoes is the absence of names. The empire kept endless records, wars catalogued, viziers listed, taxes accounted. Yet the concubines' names were rarely preserved. They existed in ledgers as numbers, sometimes as vague descriptions. Boy, age 12, from Bosnia. Then silence. This erasure wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, ensuring that their identities dissolved into anonymity. But that very absence speaks loudly. When historians search the archives, the gaps reveal more than the entries. It's as if the silence itself has become the testimony. Travellers from Europe, diplomats, and merchants who caught glimpses of the system left accounts, muted, scandalised, often incomplete. They hinted at the Sultan's favourites, at eunuchs' power, at whispered executions. Their writings, though distorted, preserve a sliver of what the Ottomans themselves tried to bury. Reading them today feels like pressing your ear to a locked door. You hear faint sounds, muffled, but enough to know something terrible once unfolded behind it. The echoes also live in architecture. Walk into the harem quarters of Topkapı, and you notice oddities. Small doors leading to hidden corridors, narrow staircases that twist into secret chambers. Windows barred not to keep intruders out, but to keep those inside from looking too far beyond. These architectural choices weren't accidents. They were instruments of control, and now, centuries later, they whisper the same message. No one here was free. You can almost see the boys lining up in silence, hear the eunuch's sandals clicking against marble, feel the air thick with perfume and dread. Stories of the black eunuchs linger too. In Ottoman memory, they are both feared and respected, remembered as guardians of the harem and power brokers in politics. But beneath those titles lies their darker role as enforcers of silence. Even today, their shadows haunt Turkish folklore, appearing as figures of both mystery and menace. That lingering image shows how deeply their dominance was etched into collective memory. The concubines themselves may be forgotten, but the men who ruled over them remain spectres in cultural memory. Another echo lies in language. Words like odaluk or köle carry connotations of slavery and servitude that stretch back centuries. In Turkish literature, faint references appear, songs of longing, poems of captivity, verses hinting at silenced lives. These fragments don't name the concubines directly, but the allusions are unmistakable. Culture remembers even what history tries to erase. The legacy is also found in how later generations judged the system. As the empire declined, Ottoman reformers themselves grew uneasy about the harem. European influence pressured them to abandon slavery, and with it, the structures that sustained concubinage. But unease didn't mean justice. The empire sought to bury its past, not to reconcile with it. The silence surrounding male concubines hardened into collective forgetting, and forgetting is its own form of cruelty. Yet the echoes refuse to fade. Modern visitors to Topkapi often remark on a strange heaviness in the air, especially in the harem. Guides tell tales of the women, their intrigues, their influence. Rarely do they speak of the boys. But when you walk those narrow halls, the absence presses harder than any story. It's as if the silence of the male concubines has seeped into the walls themselves, waiting for someone to notice. The creepiness of this legacy lies not only in what happened, but in how it lingers. History is full of conquerors and empires, but few leave such an eerie aftertaste. The Ottomans' grandeur shines in domes, mosaics, and minarets. Yet beneath that splendour lies a buried reality of silenced boys, strangled bodies, and erased identities. The echo is unsettling precisely because it contrasts so sharply with the beauty above it. It reminds you that behind every polished stone might be a shadowed secret. Even today, scholars debate the scale of the practice, piecing together scraps of evidence. Was it hundreds of boys? Thousands? How many lived? How many vanished? The lack of certainty is part of the haunting. We will never know their names, their exact numbers, their individual fates. But perhaps that very uncertainty is the echo itself, a reminder that silence was the point, and silence is what remains. And then there are the whispers of continuity. Some argue that echoes of Ottoman concubinage reverberated in later practices of control, prisons, orphanages, even certain forms of modern servitude. The mechanisms of surveillance, erasure, and absolute authority didn't die with the empire. They adapted, reappearing in new forms. The shadow of Topkapi stretches further than its walls, but the most profound echo is personal. Imagine standing in the harem today. The tiles gleaming blue and white, the fountains trickling softly. Tourists shuffle by, snapping photos. The guide's voice drones on. Yet if you pause, if you let silence settle, you feel something else. The weight of eyes that once looked out barred windows. The faint trace of perfume mingled with fear. The memory of sandals in the night. Those echoes don't belong to ghosts, they belong to history itself pressing against you, reminding you that beauty and cruelty often share the same space. And so, the story winds down not with resolution but with resonance. The concubines are gone, their names forgotten, their voices silenced. But their absence hums like a low note beneath the empire's grandeur. It reminds you that power always has a cost, and the cost is often paid by those whose names are never written. Now the lights dim in your imagination. The torches in Topkapi flicker lower. The sandals fade. The hall's empty. And as the story slips away, you feel the echoes softening too, drifting into quiet. They don't vanish entirely, they never will, but they recede, like the tide pulling back into the Bosphorus, leaving the stones wet with memory. And here, in the final breaths of this history, the wind down begins. The words stretch longer now, the cadence slower, as if the palace itself exhales after centuries of holding its breath. You're safe, listening in your own room, far from marble corridors and silk cords. The echoes are only history, unable to reach you. Let the heaviness fall away. Let the silence become gentle, not fearful. Breathe in slowly. Imagine the sea outside Istanbul, the water lapping softly against the shore. No eunuchs patrol there, no cords tighten in the night. Only waves, steady and calm. Breathe out, letting the tension go with it. The story has been dark, but night stories always are. They remind you of shadows so that the morning feels brighter. Picture the sky above the palace turning pale with dawn. The tiles shimmer with early light, the fountains gleam. The voices are gone now, fading into history. All that remains is quiet, and in that quiet you can rest. So close your eyes, sink into the silence, and let sleep take you. The echoes will linger in history, but tonight they will not trouble you. Tonight they are only whispers, fading softer and softer until they dissolve completely into calm.